Good morning, folks. Welcome. Happy Monday and welcome to our weekly call for community solutions hosted by the Forbes Funds and GPNP. For those of you who haven't joined us before, our team has hosted these community calls weekly since March of 2020 to provide nonprofits with critical resources and updates, a shared space to discuss challenges, a snapshot of relevant policies, and timely insight from subject matter experts. Since that time, the Forbes Funds and GPNP have hosted 5,666 meetings with the participation of over 48,561 community members. We do all of this utilizing a dual framework that, utilizing a dual framework that draws on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and the social determinants of health to align cross-sector and guide the outcomes of our work. Additionally, the 8 returns model guides how we measure the success or returns on various forms of our investment. For today's call, we encourage you to go ahead and use the chat function to share your name and organization with the group, as well as any comments or questions you might have during today's call. We also strongly encourage you to join us on screen to maximize engagement. We'll reserve time for a Q&A after our speaker presentation, followed by the Forbes Funds GPNP ecosystem updates and a public policy recap from our GPNP director, Emily Francis. And as a friendly reminder, please remember to take the poll at the end of our call so that we can keep our content relevant to you. So today we have joining us Craig Maier on Rewriting the System, Why Story Matters for Social Impact. So last week, the Forbes Funds began a strategic collaboration with the Philadelphia-based social impact publication Generocity to tell new stories about the Pennsylvania nonprofit sector. And today, Craig, who authored the first article in the series, is going to explore how storytelling helps nonprofit leaders clarify purpose, sustain trust, and guide action. Craig is a community educator, researcher, and coach who helps people, organizations, and communities flourish. As director of our research labs, he spearheads the Forbes Fund's thought leadership efforts while helping it expand its coaching, consulting, and capacity building offerings. A former professor of nonprofit leadership communication, he's a professional certified coach by the International Coaching Federation and the author of 2 books and numerous articles on crisis, change, and transformational leadership. So I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Craig. Thank you so much for joining us, Craig.
All right, thank you. And let's see, let me share my screen. Yeah, here we go. Yeah. All right, there we go. And got that. And start the slideshow. All right. So let me talk. We'll stop this now. I will stop share and then we'll reshare. Um, what this is about is this presentation is growing from the work that we're doing with Generosity, as Christine was just saying. Generosity is a social impact publication in Philadelphia that's doing really great work. And we started a collaboration with them recently that is trying to share information, share resources, tell different kinds of stories. The Generosity is really interested in what's going on in the Pittsburgh region. They're trying to learn from the wisdom that the Pittsburgh nonprofits and the Pittsburgh philanthropic sector have that they can take back into their communities. And also, we want to be able to foster stronger relationships and stronger collaboration across the state specifically between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And this is the first foray into that. They're going to be on soon. We don't. I think Christine is going to be reaching out, and we're going to be having some dates about when they're going to be showing up in sometime in the near future. So I don't want to steal their thunder and talk about what they do. What I'm going to be talking about today is what we just did. I we last week we had the very first story, and I'm going to actually share that in the chat to everybody. The first story came out, and this story grew out of some of the challenges that they're having in some of the communities in Philadelphia around libraries. And we had a conversation about, well, what was going on there and what their challenges were. And the conversation really began to focus in on social infrastructure and what that might mean. And then we that grew into a story about that featured Neighborhood North in Beaver Falls and what they're doing, because that children's museum actually grew out of a need to help support the library, and so it became a really interesting story about how nonprofits can begin to engage the community, how they can begin to build social infrastructure and shape um, what's going on around them. And what we're trying to think about today is I'm seeing that story and about the work that we're doing with Generosity as falling into what I'm calling narrative leadership, which kind of grows out of what's often called narrative empowerment, how we're telling stories and retelling stories in different ways to to give voice to folks, to create and highlight resources, and to imagine different possibilities for the future. So that is the background. And what I want to talk about today is what is this thing that we're just doing? And and as a way of just exploring this. So again, what is narrative leadership? And the idea behind narrative leadership is this. We live in systems, and we often talk about systems a lot as nonprofit leaders. We emphasize systems thinking, systems leadership, and so forth. But we live in systems that are shaped by stories we're not, or often not aware that we're telling, or that are being told around us. And what narrative empowerment tries to do is to surface different types of stories. How can we begin to pay attention to the stories so that we can begin to notice not only what's broken, but also what's working? How can we begin to rewrite the stories around us so that we can surface new strengths and resources, create different types of connections, imagine new possibilities? And then how can we then begin to share the stories that we've just rewritten to foster belonging and alignment and create change? That's essentially the theory of change here. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of narrative leadership. How can we begin to use storytelling as part of our leadership practice? Because if you're a leader, you are dealing in stories all the time. You're telling stories, and it's just part of what you do. Every time you run a meeting, every time you do a strategic planning, all these things, you're telling the story about your organization. And when we are writing the stories with Generosity, that's going to be a lot of the things that I'm going to be focusing on when we talk. That's actually my background is actually in narrative. My PhD is in communication. And the framework actually is a framework that I developed through my own research here. So I'm fitting that in here too. So when we're talking about the story, we're talking about three things. What is a story? And the story here has three different areas that we're talking about. We're talking about goods, we're talking about practices, and we're talking about actions. So when we're talking about goods, that's where we start. What is this story about? What's at stake here? And then we're thinking about practices. What are the sorts of things that begin to tie us together? What connects the characters of the story to each other? what anchors them, what roots them. And then the third part is actions. How can we begin to write the next chapter, which then moves into goods? How can we understand? How can we understand our goods differently? How if we're creating new practices? This is an ongoing process of writing and rewriting. So, just really brief, goods. What's the story about? And we're thinking about goods. We're thinking about again what's at stake here. But we're not just working toward one good. We're actually often working toward multiple goods. And these goods can align, they can compete, they can change in priority over time. And stories offers us a way of noticing, naming, and integrating them. How can we begin to put them together? And that was one of the interesting things about the story that I was doing with Generosity. So in this story, it starts out by talking about libraries and museums and how they begin to serve the community, this idea of social infrastructure. The types of ways, the types of things, and social infrastructure, if you're not familiar with the term, is the work of a sociologist named Eric Kleinenberg, who argued that we spend so much time talking about physical infrastructure, things like roads, things like uh, uh, sewers, free Wi-Fi access, those types of things, that we really miss the social infrastructure that we need to survive as people. So, and that can be a whole bunch of things, um, things like community gardens, farmers markets, green spaces, playgrounds, sports fields, places where people can begin to meet and congregate. And one of the fascinating things for Kleinenberg is he says that libraries are actually perhaps the most powerful form of social infrastructure that we have. That was the connection that I saw when Generosity was talking about their problems with libraries. This is not simply about an education issue. This was a social infrastructure issue. And when you look at the libraries and what they do, there's so much that happens within libraries that connects community, that creates community within the libraries. And I reached out to Christine Kroger at Neighborhood North, who also is very familiar with Eric Kleinenberg's work. And we had a conversation about that. But it turns out that when we're looking at that story, it's not just simply about the good that libraries can create for a community. It's also a story about equity, about children and youth, about the relationships that we're building, about the importance of education, and the trust that we need to create with communities, and the commitment that we need to create within communities. All of these things are goods. And the thing that's really important is that when we're writing these stories, we can begin to notice and name these things. And when we can notice and name these things, because story kind of slows it all down for us, we can begin to begin to focus in on them and begin to step into them a little bit more. It enriches the story. So part of the thing that we're looking at trying to do here is really deepen the stories that we're telling, to begin to begin to connect and frame what matters. All right. So that's good. Practices. What are the things that are going to be tying us together? So practices are connected to goods. Practices are habits that help us become what we value. If we value social infrastructure in our community, what are we doing to sustain that? If we value trust within our community or our organization, what are we doing to sustain it? Right? So that's the thing. Practices connect us to each other. They sustain us to each other, sustain our life together. And what was interesting about this story is when when Neighborhood North was beginning, what they were doing was something they Christine actually said that when Neighborhood North started, they were not even in the business of creating a museum. That wasn't the first thing that they were thinking about. They just noticed that there was an issue within the community. There were maybe several issues with the community. And then they started organizing around it. And so there were several key practices that she was doing: listening to other people, right? Asking questions, following through on promises, staying, just being stubborn, right? A practice of stubbornness, right? Again, noticing these things is really important. We need to notice them so we can begin to lift them up. All right. And practices don't need to be huge, grand things. They're often quite small, right? What are we doing if we say that we value certain things? What are we doing to back those things up in our everyday leadership practice? Those are the two, that's step two. And then three, how can we begin to write the next chapter? And so when we're thinking about stories, when we're thinking about narrative leadership, we're talking about telling stories in small intentional steps. We're not talking about instant transformation. We're talking about chapters over time. And again, that was the thing that was so important about the story that we're telling here, about how this is a story about organizing, right? More than anything else. And again, when Neighborhood North began, it did not begin with the intent of creating a museum. It noticed the problem and began to move through chapter by chapter. Chapter one is beginning to organize and beginning to listen, begin to ask questions, and then that leads to creating pop-up after school programs, that which leads to creating a temporary home, which leads to this renovating a more permanent one that they have right now, that is beginning to prop up the uh, the um, the library around it. It's actually interesting because the future home of Neighborhood North is actually on the campus of the Free Library of Beaver Falls, or Carnegie Library of Beaver Falls. They and there's and that's intentional because they want to tie them together, not to compete with each other, but to prop each other up. And so so that's the sort of interesting stories that we're trying to create here. And again, as we're talking about moving this toward a neighborhood narrative leadership, what we want to be doing is, again, in this time of a lot of uncertainty within the sector, what we want to be able to do to highlight stories and begin to tell stories that can begin to share information to help us to, again, understand what's at stake, right? Understand what's connecting your organization and your community together. What's tying us together? What's at stake here? What do we need to advance? What do we need to protect and promote? What do we need to do to be connecting ourselves to each other so that we can become to we can begin to live the values that we say that we value, right? And then what's this next chapter look like? How do we begin to do that? So in a sense, that is in a nutshell what we're doing here with this. And I just want to open this up for discussion.
Thank you so much, Craig. I'm going to take a look and see if we have any hands raised or questions in the chat. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to go ahead and add them to the chat. And Craig, I'm going to go ahead and share, that was the article that you shared, correct, earlier?
Mhm.
Let me go ahead and share that and generosities. So Craig, could you tell us a little bit more about what instigated this project and this partnership? I'm sorry, Emily, I just saw your question. I'll go ahead and let Craig, just to help the audience understand what led to this and why we're working on it.
Well, I think what led to this is this project with Generosity. Um, what I understand it was that the Generosity had reached out to Olivia Benson, and they had began to talk about the need to create a greater connection between the sectors um, in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, to begin to build, to share information, to learn from each other, and also to start maybe breaking down some of the geographic barriers that we have between each other. And so that we can begin to tell a shared story around that. So that's my understanding of what the genesis of this project was. Yeah.
Thank you. That's what I was going for. I think I really wanted to highlight here how the ultimate goal here is to build those partnerships, break down barriers, and that this is an important part of that. Emily, go ahead, and then we have a question from Dan in the chat.
Thank you. And thank you for the presentation, Craig. I'm really excited about this partnership with Generosity, and I know we have some other things in the works with them as well. My question is related to a phrase that you paused on that I just wanted to highlight, which is the practice of stubbornness. And I think in some places, with recent TED Talks, it's been like called grit or like stick-to-itiveness. What are some of the things that having that skill set or that practice of stubbornness can really bring to that storytelling? I would love for you to elaborate on that.
Well, it's interesting because that was actually something that came up with in the conversation with Christine is the what she was doing and she was talking about how building what they were trying to build in Beaver Falls is challenging because of the resources that are available because of just if they had been trying to build this there could have been a number of different places where this could have been built a lot more easily. But she really made a commitment to the community. Said this is something that this community really needs, and and there have been a lot of people who've come into the community. She said. With great ideas and great plans and create a lot of excitement, and then they would leave. And so what she said is that no, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to be stubborn and we're going to stick to it. And that's really, I think, what that practice is. It's this commitment to follow through.
Thank you.
And then we have from Dan, can you go over the progression of programs and organizations that originated from your efforts again? Specifically, what were the problems you were seeing on the ground and those baby steps that you did take?
Well, so this is again, this is within the context of this story, and I think this illustrates how when we look at at a program at an organization, this is this is a process of development, right? We're looking at this as any organization in its life is going to is a story with many chapters in it. And so what we want to be thinking about is what are the chapters in this story, and then what's the next one. So when we start out again with Neighborhood North, chapter one is we notice that there's an issue. Chapter two is we start talking with folks about this issue and bring people together, and then we start building relationships around this issue, and then we say, okay, well maybe what we need to do is we need to think about developing some after school programs, right? That's maybe chapter three. And then chapter four is after that, we're building a sustained relationship with the community. Then maybe we want to start to make things a little more permanent. So we're creating more pop-up facilities. We're maybe renting temporary spaces. And then in chapter five, we're developing more permanent. We're starting to begin to develop more permanent roots in the community. To say this is something that we really want and develop this idea for this museum. I think that again the fascinating thing about Neighborhood North is a children's museum that did not start out with wanting to with wanting to be a children's museum. It's a story that starts with we're noticing there's a problem with our community and education and what we're doing with how we're resourcing young people. And then we notice that all the things that people want can be it can only be uh, met. All those needs can only be met through a children's museum. So it's something that's an evolutionary process, right? And so what we're seeing here is to see the development of your organization as being a story that you're telling over time. And you're telling that you're writing it line by line, scene by scene, chapter by chapter. And so what we're looking at right now is again where we are as a sector is, what chapter are we on? Right. And we're writing that chapter now. And so and again, so to get back to your question, Dan, this is just one data point, one story that we wanted to pull together. I think what we want to do is we want to do many more of these, and then we begin to weave those into a broader story about where the sector is and where it's going.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Craig. And take one more look to see if we have any final questions. And I do not. So we're going to go ahead and pass it over to Emily for our public policy update. Thank you so much, Craig. And again, stay tuned. We will be having Generocity and Craig back on our community call to do some more updating on this work. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Emily. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And Craig, don't go anywhere just yet, because one of the first updates that I wanted to remind folks of is that we're going to be doing a survey within the next couple of weeks around the economic impacts of tariffs. And I just wanted to give you space to talk a little bit about that. I have the slides that I can kind of share in the background, but I was on a call with Reimagine Appalachia a couple weeks ago, and one of the things that their guest speakers talked about during that meeting and also again last week is that nonprofits don't often put the impacts of policy challenges or work that we're doing in economic context, and so it can be a language barrier for a lot of folks who understand what inflation is going to mean for them personally. They don't often think about what it means for community organizations. And there's going to be a study published in the next couple of weeks from the Pennsylvania Association of Nonprofit Organizations. Our policy committee has worked over the last couple of years to get support from the Senate Budget and Finance Committee to look at, through a university, what is the impact of nonprofit organizations on our economy in Pennsylvania. And for the last few years, I've been saying, nonprofits make up 15% of Pennsylvania's workforce. It's actually 16% based on the very early summaries pulled from that study. And that's 3% more than the national average, I believe. And so in a state where nonprofits and philanthropy make up so much of our workforce, and that's just employed individuals, that's not including volunteers, that's not including board members, that's not including people served. I just wanted to give a little bit of space to you this morning to kind of share the importance of storytelling and the importance of our relationship with Generocity, really bridging similar narratives across the state, especially as it relates to this tariff survey. Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
It's okay. Basically, again, what we want to think about is, for this survey, I think again, this is part of a broader project that we're hoping to do with Generosity, as well as really begin to understand the macroeconomic context of nonprofit leadership. What's going on we know how things like or we're looking at things of how Medicaid cuts and other types of funding freezes are going to be influencing the day-to-day microeconomic issues that nonprofits face. But tariffs is a really tariffs and inflation and those types of pressures are really complicated because they impact the entire environment that nonprofits are in. So I think we're going to be really interested in just especially over the next several months, understanding how um, how these changes are affecting nonprofits here, and potentially also if we can begin to move forward with this, what's going on in Philadelphia, how can we we can begin to create a conversation, about what's affecting people, and what we can begin to do to transform that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And sorry to put you on the spot, but I'm really excited about being able to better share that story with and on behalf of so many nonprofits in our region, because it is something that I think is a critical moment in advocacy to recognize not only the power of storytelling, but storytelling using the right words and to the right people is really how we start to bridge some of these conversations that it seems like we can't always get a solid hold on. It seems very clear, like you should support this policy because it makes people's lives better, or you should oppose this policy because it makes people's lives more difficult. But being able to say, by how much, and what are some of the secondary and tertiary impacts that also are going to reflect back on that specific elected official or that specific organization, is the part of the story that really it is tangible to a lot of folks. And so a lot of times we see that nonprofits have to go that extra mile, not only to build that story that spans through the time that the organization is in existence and through the portion of a project, but also in some of those larger contexts too. And it's tough. I don't want to make this sound like it's an easy thing by any means, but getting the data to be able to support nonprofits in telling their own stories about, what's happening, what the impacts on organizations are, is where, we're working with Generocity, and really excited to get that partnership moving. And so you'll hear more updates again from the Generosity team in a couple of weeks, but also in our newsletter. So stay tuned. All right, back to regularly scheduled programming. Thank you, Craig. We're going to be looking at a couple of environmental headlines and implications that are specific to Southwest Pennsylvania, but also tied to some broader environmental policy landscape items from the federal government. So we know that there are some rollbacks on requirements for regulation on companies that are impacting the environment, whether that's air quality or water quality or soil quality. And so looking at Pennsylvania or Southwest Pennsylvania specifically, there are some U.S. Steel and other industry leaders who have sought exemptions from updated air pollution regulations, and this would potentially increase emissions in this region. And so this is on the heels of, conversations about the Shell cracker plant, and just kind of ongoing reviews of the water quality in our rivers, but also the air quality in the region, because this is an industrial area historically. And so looking at, reevaluating the social cost of carbon, that's something that the Trump administration has initiated a review of, which is going to affect the stringency of future environmental regulations. And related to this, we know that the federal funding for the restoration of Max Ivanka murals in Millville has been reinstated, which does highlight the volatility of support for cultural preservation projects. This is something that was restored because of pressure around communication that environmental regulations are there for a reason, and that monitoring air quality, water quality, and looking at advocacy that is taking place in these spaces to push back on lessening those regulations is really important, and it is working. And we're seeing the effects of that, as locally in Southwest PA as Millville. Looking at the Clean Air Act, the air quality standards that are mandated through that act regulate hazardous air pollutants. Exemptions have been granted to facilities like U.S. Steel, and they're looking for future exemptions over the next 2 years, which would again continue to raise legal and public health concerns. And then the social cost of carbon, just as background, is a tool for assessing the economic impact of carbon emissions in policymaking. And this is looking at what are some of the cost benefit analyses of doing this type of industry work that does result in emissions. But revisiting that metric would again weaken the justification for making environmental regulations more stringent. And so if there's an opportunity cost for things like caring about the environment and the emissions that make it into the air or water, that is something that this social cost of carbon, in addition to the public health impacts, would become part of that conversation and is sort of that justification. And so those are the major one in the news is, of course, with U.S. Steel. A couple of other exemptions have been sought recently within the region. So looking at Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, the president can grant such exemptions if compliance technologies are unavailable or if it's deemed a national security interest. U.S. Steel is arguing that the new standards aren't supported by science and law, imposing significant costs and setting technically unachievable standards. And so again, working up, this raises issues with the county health department, environmental groups and nonprofits that are within our ecosystem, as well as environmental and public health officials. And so I know that's a little bit of a deeper dive than we usually do, but understanding things like what this social cost of carbon metric looks like put against things like air quality or water quality standards is really important to be able to have these conversations and advocate for public health. Second, related to healthcare, not related to environmental healthcare, but back to the Medicaid cuts conversation, there's a additional layer of restructuring the Department of Health and Human Services, which is posing significant challenges for nonprofits in Southwest PA, which challenge not only healthcare access and public health infrastructure and operational capacity, but also transparency of navigating for those who need supports and services from those types of resources. And so looking at the Medicaid funding reductions, it seems like House Republicans have backed a little bit off the Medicaid cuts. They're avoiding the deepest cuts, but it's still the current, I think the current proposal is still looking at some kind of across the board cuts towards Medicaid that are still going to impact about 3 million Pennsylvanians who are enrolled in the program if those cuts do take place. Again, the Health and Human Services Make America Healthy Again initiative has also led to the consolidation of health and human services agencies, significant staff reductions, which is impacting the department's ability to manage public health programs in response to disease outbreaks. It's unclear how this is going to trickle down to local health and human services departments and government. And then finally, looking at decreasing budgets for Centers for Disease Control and Prevention to monitor and respond to infectious disease outbreaks. There's a lot of folks that are talking about norovirus recently, are not able to find up-to-date information about coronavirus or measles in certain municipalities and geographies. There have been a lot of resources that have been posted on YouTube or other non-technically published journals to kind of help surveil or kind of create gap coverage while those resources to communicate and tell the stories about how these diseases are evolving are down. But again, the goal of this is to put all of these things together. So we're seeing decreased funding or proposed for decreased funding for things like Medicaid, which supports in whole or in part 41% of births in the United States. You have a restructuring of the Health and Human Services Department at the federal level, unclear what that's going to mean at the local level. And also there's less surveillance capacity for disease prevention and intervention. And so looking at, uncertainty of healthcare in the United States, this is an area where kind of gap coverage from the nonprofit sector hasn't been seen. But we're kind of flagging that as an update to be something that we need to keep an eye on in the next coming months and years. And then finally, just a review of other quick items. I'm sure everyone is seeing a lot in the headlines recently. There's a lot to keep track of. And so just kind of keeping an eye on these 4 things. So one, these are currently unfolding, ongoing conversations. One, academic labor rights. So this is something that locally in Southwest PA, there's some graduate student workers from University of Pennsylvania who have voted to unionize, seeking better wages and working conditions. The university has challenged unionization efforts currently and in the past, raising questions about labor rights in private academic institutions. This is happening alongside the larger conversation around the role of universities in federal funding. And so something to keep in mind as another element of that conversation, looking at Election law reforms. Now, this is a state level update. House Bill 771 would propose stricter voter ID requirements. This is separate from the federal SAVE Act on voter ID requirements. This is from the Pennsylvania House, and this would mandate voters to prevent specific forms of identification at the polling booth. And this would disenfranchise many voter groups, while others claim that it ensures election integrity. There are just challenges, both financial and physical, to being able to present these types of documentation at the polls. And this would also update our mail-in ballot requirements as well. Demographic changes. So in the midst of these conversations about economics and community development in Southwest PA, especially as federal funding and policies are impacting our region, we are still experiencing population declines, particularly in our rural counties. And so as we're doing this work across party lines in terms of advocacy and bringing in that economic component to the arguments that we're making for a specific policy's impact on our work as nonprofit organizations, this is something that nonprofits should be aware of as something that is improving access to basic needs and resources for community members is something that stabilizes lives. And so looking at continued projections of a declining population, which would impact things like workforce availability, service demands, the ability for certain industries to come to this region and bolster our economy, something to think about in terms of our advocacy conversations. And then finally, it's been a while since we've talked about broadband, but we are expecting broadband expansion delays. Jen Blatz from the Greater Pittsburgh Digital Inclusion Alliance last year during the state budget appropriations committee presentations in Southwest PA was asking, why does the state budget not include things like broadband? And there have been updates, in the year since, but many of the conversations to expand broadband access have stalled at this point because there are administrative delays, because of wage disputes, and because of the potential loss of federal funding, which would improve, if awarded, would have improved digital equity efforts. And that's something that is definitely being impacted by the cuts right now. And so just looking at, impact on Southwest Pennsylvania nonprofits for each of those things, looking at the precedents that the university conversations are setting for 501c3 status, the conversation around unionization is also likely to affect our conversations about labor practices in our industry. Civic engagement groups, so stricter voter ID laws are likely to increase the need for voter education and assistance programs, putting more demand on nonprofits that to promote civic participation, not only to help people, register on time and in advance, but also understand what types of funding or budget might need to be created in order to update paperwork or get access to, proper documentation for individuals who don't have it, and make sure that they're doing that on a specific timeline. So really understanding how those laws changing are going to impact community education. Community service providers impacted by population declines. So if there's any funding that is based on number of individuals served and folks are leaving the region, that's something that is an ongoing challenge. And also it's difficult to recruit volunteers. And then finally, looking at the broadband expansion, I mentioned the, federal funding impact and equity efforts, but also bridging the digital divide, affecting nonprofits that rely on internet access to deliver services, engage with constituents. A couple of years ago during COVID, we talked about how telehealth was a uniting advocacy issue, one for the first time since folks looking at infrastructure, education, and mental health, because all three of those industries impact telehealth and the ability to deliver education over the internet with COVID and folks not being able to be in person. And so I think this is an area where we're also going to see a lot of collective advocacy from partners that typically don't align on the same issues, really joining the conversation on those areas. As you're continuing to build those advocacy muscles and get more involved, I'm always going to be highlighting the National Council of Nonprofits resources and advocacy toolkits, and also their updates, trends and policy issues, executive orders that are impacting the sector. I definitely encourage you to stay up to date on those. And Christine, I'll pass it back to you in just a second to update on the transformative leadership cohort before we call out. But thank you to everyone who participated in the first call for speaker speaker applications. Our team is reviewing those, and you'll receive an email from us to move on to kind of the next stage of kind of speaker prep for our summit this year, which is deciding, is this a presentation or a potential speaking opportunity for one of our lead up events to the summit in the summer and fall months, or does it make sense for a panel discussion, presentation, or session at the summit this year? So more to come. And then for any individuals who are kind of on the fence about presenting, we'll be doing a second call for applications or speaker asks in next week after we go through and kind of organize the responses from the first call. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. We have, calls for community solutions. We can do webinars. There's a lot of different ways to address and engage with the GPNP ecosystem and nonprofit sector more broadly. And there's also pathways to things like, Robert Morris University's Bear Center or Pano or other presentations through partners of ours. So if there's a topic or presentation that you'd really like to deliver, this is definitely a space to build it out. And we have a consultant, Adam Pulisic, who's also coaching speakers in advance of the summit in terms of things like audience engagement or presentation prep and follow-up materials distribution. And Christine, I will turn it back to you to close us out.
Thank you so much, Emily. And Erica, I did see your question about the slide. We can go back at the end, but also there will be a recording available on our YouTube channel and on the member portal, so you can always recap at any time. Yes, so we have the Transformative Leadership and Golf cohort coming up at First Tee. We're looking at June 26th for the date for that mixer. We'll be sending out more details in the newsletter this Friday. Feel free to fill out the interest form to get more information. And then Emily, if you wouldn't mind skipping to the next slide. We will have Meredith from Global Wordsmiths next week, so we hope you can join us. We will also hear a bit from Dan Little from Involvement. We'll hear a bit more about their event coming up, Solar Punk. So yeah, we are very grateful you were all here to join us today. Good luck this week, and we will see you next week. Thanks so much.